So in the Mishnah on Daf Chavav Amid Beis, there is an issue here about the shape of the shofar, and we discussed this at great length. And the question is whether the shofar of Rosh Hashanah should be pashut, should be straight, or kafuf, it should be bent down. And the Gemara tells us that in fact this is the subject of a machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim. And the Mishnah mentions Rabbi Yehuda, the Gemara expands on Rabbi Yehuda, and the Gemara says on the bottom of Chavav in days that Mar Sovar, according to the Tanakama, the Rosh Hashana, Kama deposit inish daite tfei malay. So we're talking about the lathe of a person, and a person should have a straight lathe. That's what he needs on Rosh Hashanah. In the language of the of some of the Bali Musa, it's liyasher akmimius haleh. And sometimes the heart is distorted and it moves in this direction, that direction. We have to flatten it out so that it's straight. And that's what's appropriate for Rosh Hashanah. So we blow in a shofar that's partial. Okay. Now we go back to the Shita of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says, Mar Sovar b'Rosh Hashanah kama dekayef inish daite tfei mayim. Sheyochav Adam Daito Yachnia Yoses Libo. It's better that he bend over his mind, so to speak, and subjugate himself totally to the Ribono Shel Olam. And that's why the shape of the shofar, meaning kafuf, should reflect this idea of kayef inchi daite tfei mayim. The Rambam opens up Hilchos Shofar, as you'll see in the page I sent you. The shofar shetokin bo bein b'Rosh Hashanah bein b'Yovel hu keren akvasim akafu. So it should be kafu, bent down. And the Ravid in his Hasagas, right? Omer Avram, hifriz al midosav el mitzvah b'kfufim. Fine. If the Rambam would have said that it would be preferable to use a shofar kafuf, that I could understand. But in Taka B'Shal Yael has a flat, straight shape. Its horn has a straight shape. Yotza. And the Maggid Mishnah, in his comment on this Rambam, says that according to the Rambam, kafuf is ma'akiv b'di'evet. If you blew on a shofar that was not kafuf, you did not fulfill and discharge your duty of shofar. You're going to have to blow the shofar a second time. Just shut this door. Now, in order to shed a light on this whole sugi of kafuf and why kafuf is, according to Rabbi Yehuda, preferable or even critical, we look at Rashi, and Rashi here says kama dekayef inchi b'tfiloso. So Rashi invokes the analogy between shofar and tefillah. That just like in tefillah we should bow and bend. Hanav kvushim la'aretz tvei adam. It's better if his face is bent over towards the ground. And he quotes a pasuk: "Mishuv v'hayu einay b'libi shav." Hilchos Rosh Hashanah. We blow the shofar l'tefillah. Ulahazkir akedes yisav ba v'inon kafuf. We require kafuf. So again, what we see from Rashi is that the concept of kafuf in shofar is borrowed from tefillah. And Rashi quotes the pasuk, "V'hoya eni v'libi sham." And then later on, in order to explain the chachamim who require shofar pashut, Rashi invokes a different pasuk, "Misa levavenu el kapayim." The Gemara quotes these psukim in Masechet Yevamos Kufayim and Beis to shed a light on the two opinions as to whether a mispalel, when you daven, he should look towards the bottom, based on V'hoya eni v'libi sham, or he should look upwards towards the higher heavens because of the pasuk B'nisa levavenu el kapayim. And Rashi here in Rosh Hashana is identifying our issue, the Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda, about whether a shofar should be kafuf or pashut, with the same argument with regard to tefillah, whether the proper posture for tefillah is to be bowed or to be straight. And all this is because shofar is the shofar of tefillah. Now the Rambam requires kafuf b'di'evet, li'kuva. He holds that as far as tefillah is concerned, it's not just to beautify our shofar and connect it to tefillah. It's not just the tosefes b'alma, but it's guf mitzvah shofar. It's the essence and the critical part of the mitzvah shofar. Uma'akim b'di'evet. And kafuf is an absolute critical requirement. So if you blew in a shofar pashut, you're not yotzei. The Rambam holds you have to blow again for the shofar kafuf. So the question is the following. The Gemara says in Rosh Hashanah Daf Chav Ches. Let's take a quick jump over to Chav Ches. Three lines up before the end of the Amud, in the name of Rava, Tokel Shir Yatza. So he blew the shofar not for the sake of shofar, but rather for the sake of shir. He wanted to produce those sounds, reverie. Lefishan is Bayer, Shetfila, Be'inon, that shofar has to be connected to tefillah, which we do through kafuf. So how could he be yotze with shofar and tokel shir? He has no connection to tefillah whatsoever. In other words, if the critical essential dimension of tefillah in shofar expresses itself in the fact that shofar has to be kafuf, then clearly if he's tokel shir, he cannot fulfill his mitzvah of shofar. He has no connection to tefillah whatsoever. You see, Rav Soloveitchik in this paragraph is connecting the tzuras hashofar, the shape of the shofar, with the kavanah that he has when he hears the shofar. If the shape of the shofar has to reflect the connection to tefillah, it's got to be kafuf, And as Rashi says, just like in tefillah we require kofuf, according to that shita, we're going to paskin in shofar that like that man the omer in tefillah that requires kofuf, and the shofar therefore has to be kofuf. All this is to connect the shofar to tefillah. Then that should be halacha that is not just relevant to the shape of the shofar, but to the actual kavanah that you have when you blow the shofar. And if you're blowing the shofar simply because of musical notes, obviously you have no relationship to tefillah whatsoever. במבואר בזה, רק השופר עצמו צריך להיות רוי לעניין תפילה. We have to differentiate between the shofar and the kavanah of the person who's hearing the shofar. As far as the shofar is concerned, we absolutely critically require that it has an element of tefillah and that its surah of kafuf reflects that dimension of tefillah. Aval akiyum tefillah b'fa'al, when I would say the Gabra, when he's fulfilling his mitzvah of tefillah, is eino ma'akiv b'shofar. So I think what the Rav is saying here is there's a difference between the chefts of the mitzvah and the Maaseh Gavra in implementing the mitzvah. Now, I would have said intuitively just the opposite, that if there's a connection between tefillah and shofar, and that's an essential connection that's required, that when the Gavra hears the shofar, he should be connected to tefillah. I'm not so impressed with the shofar. The Rav is saying just the opposite, that what's critical is to connect the shofar itself to tefillah, i.e. make it kafuf. But as far as your experience of implementing the mitzvah of shofar and hearing the shofar, here tefillah plays a secondary role. It takes a back seat. And even if you're blowing for the sake of musical accompaniment, you have no relationship at all to the mitzvah, you're a yotze. And he gives a fascinating analogy. The Gemara establishes on Daf Chav Tesam and Beis that a lulav has to have the minimum share of 4 tefachim, whereas the aravos and the adasim only require 3 tefachim. So the Gemara asks, why does lulav need a 4th tefach? And the Gemara says that's part of the mitzvah of nanuim. But when you do the nanuim, the lulav should rise above the other 2 minim that are part of the aga. Now that means that if the lulav is less than 4 tefachim, you're not yotze. The lulav is pasul. Because there's no possibility of what? Of nanuim. And yet the Gemara establishes that if you pick up the lulav without nanuim, you just lift it up, you yotze. So nanuim is very nice, it embellishes the mitzvah. But you can fulfill the mitzvah without the nanuim. And yet the lulav itself, if it's less than 4 tefachim, is possible. Why? Because it's not royal and nanuim. But nanuim, you just told me, is not critical. But again, the same idea. Yeah, what do you say, Steve?
Needs the potential for the anunim.
The chefza itself has to have the potential. If the chefza doesn't meet up to your standards of how would it be possible to do nanuim, then the chefetz is possible. As far as the kiyum hagavra is concerned, implementing the act of lifting l'kachtem lachem, here nanuim is an embellishment, but it's not critical. So there's an exact parallel. Just like the chefetz of the shofar has to be indicative of tefillah, that's called kafu, but the Masechet Gavra doesn't have to have any connection to tefillah. He hears the shofar and he's listening to the musical notes of the shofar. He has no connection to tefillah. He's Yotze, and the perfect parallel is in the case of a shear of lulav, that the lulav has to be 4 tefachim high minimum in order to facilitate nanuim, but it means to make it possible for nanuim. And if not, the chefza is not royal in nanuim, it's possible. But yet nanuim itself is not likuma, it's not critical in the kiyum mitzvah. V'hachinami shofar. Shofar atzmo tzarich lios roy l'kaybo mitzvah shel tefillah k'deboy al yidei tkiyos. Aval bi'idach gama tokel l'shir greda she'ein bo kiyum shel tefillah yotza. So Tokel Shir is parallel to Mida Agbe Nofikbe. In both cases, whether it's shofar or it's lulav, he did not have that additional kiyum. In the case of shofar, he blew it for the musical enjoyment, and he didn't have that additional kiyum of tefillah. In the case of lulav, he Mida Agbe Nofikbe, he just lifted it up and he did not fulfill the mitzvah of nanuim. So the mitzvah nanum, as far as the kiyum hagavra is like tefillah in shofar, it's an additional embellishment and dimension of the mitzvah, but it's not critical. But in both cases, the chefetz has to be roy, has to be fit for the complete mitzvah, the perfect mitzvah, the ideal mitzvah, which would mean the shofar has to be kafu, and the lulav has to be 4 tefachim high. Now, I don't know if it came out in your photograph, but I wrote a few notes on the side. And even if you could read these notes, you might not understand what I have in mind. I found a parallel in the case of matzah. The Gemara says that matzah mivusheles lo yotza. If he takes matzah that was baked, perfectly good matzah, and then he cooks it in hot water, and then he eats it, he's not yotze. Now again, exactly how that pans out la'alocha, different question, has to do with a chola who can't chew the matzah. They boil it for him, whatever. But in a pure theoretical world, you're not yotze with the matzah b'musheles. And the reason for that, explains the Rishonim, is because he cannot taste the time of matzah. It loses in the process of bishul, of cooking, its time of matzah. The time of matzah you can only feel when it's a baked matzah. However, the Gemara establishes that bola matzah yotza. If he takes the matzah and he swallows the kizayis of matzah, he doesn't taste the matzah at all. It doesn't go through his taste buds. And yet he's yotze. How could that be? You just finished telling me that if the matzah is mivusheles, if the matzah itself was cooked, and therefore it lost its time, doesn't have a tam matzah, you're not yotze. So you see that tam, the taste of matzah, to write a book, the taste of matzah, is absolutely critical. And yet, bola matzah yotza, swallows it like a pill, has no taste whatsoever, he doesn't taste it at all, he's yotze. Same thing as the Rav salvation. The chefza itself has to be roy L'kiyum mitzvah b'shleimus. The matzah has to be lend itself, has to be fit for tam matzah. You cook the matzah and you mafkia the tam matzah, it's no longer matzah's mitzvah. But as far as the kiyum agavra, when he implements the achila, he doesn't have to taste the taste of matzah. You know, they have this thing, I think it's called the Oragel. You know what I'm talking about? We used to give it a lot to our kids, you know, if they have Sa'im, they have, what's it called? Canker sores, you know what I mean? So imagine a person puts on Oragel, he freezes his taste buds, and then he eats matzah on Leil Pesach. He's Yotze. Why? Because the kiyum agavra of te'imas matzah is not likuva. It's not critical. But if the matzah loses its tam, and it's not roy to tima, then it doesn't have the name, the identity of a matzah. It's also as a chefta. It's not roy l'kiyum mitzvah. So we use the kiyum mitzvah b'shleimus to define the conditions that are required for the chefta shel mitzvah. If the kiyum mitzvah of shofar b'shleimus is to be mispalel, then the shofar as a chefta has to be roy to stimulate and to uplift us through tefillah. That means kafir. And if the chefta shel lulav l'chatchila, the mitzvah lulav requires nanuim, then the chefta shel lulav is only a chefta shel lulav if it lends itself to nanuim. How much oil is required to be placed into the Ner Chanukah? The Gemara establishes it's got to be mishetichla regel mishkia sachama ashetichla regel ben ashuk, which the posting says a half hour. You need that the candle of Chanukah should be able to be lit for a half hour. You know, sometimes they have those colored candles, you know what I'm talking about? You get them in the old days, we used to get it from the Telz Yeshiva in Cleveland. I'm really dating myself now, and probably it's not so anymore. Some of those candles will not last a half hour, but I assume they will normally last a half hour. Now, what happens if you light an Ner Chanukah? It's got a shear of shemen, but a wind comes along, unexpected, and blows out your Ner Chanukah after a split second. That's called kovza, and we paskin kovza ein zakikah. He fulfilled his mitzvah, he doesn't have to repeat it. So on the one hand, you have to have enough shemen for the candle to last for a half hour. But on the other hand, in terms of implementing the mitzvah, you could be mekayim the mitzvah even if the candle only lasts for a split second. And again, I think the Rav's logic here, his structure would apply. That the chefs has to be roy for the ideal mitzvah. And if you have less than shemen that can last for a half hour, it's not royal mitzvah. But as far as the kiyum hagavra is concerned, once he lights the candle, even though it blew out and it didn't last for that half hour, he was yotze. And I'm wondering if this could shed a light on Rashi's unique interpretation that came under so much fire of Lulav Hayovesh. Rashi says Lulav Hayovesh is possible because of Zek Kelim Yanvei. And the question is obvious. Zek Kelim Yanvei, as Tosfos points out, is only Lechatchila. It embellishes the mitzvah. But if you would be Makayim the mitzvah Dalamina without any Zek Kelim Yanvei, you were Yotzek. And yet Rashi says Lulav Hayovesh is possible because of Zek Kelim Yanvei. So I'd say the following: in the Kiyama mitzvah befall, as far as the Maisa Gavra, the Maisa mitzvah, you don't need Zekei L'Yaveh. It embellishes the mitzvah, but it's not critical. But the Cheft itself has to be roy, it has to lend itself to that additional embellishment, that ideal Kiyam of Zekei L'Yaveh. And once it's Yavesh, it's completely excluded, it's mufka from any element of Zekei L'Yaveh. So the Chefetz doesn't lend itself to the full-fledged kiyum, bishlemus, of Zekei L'Yaveh. Hence, the lulav is possible. As far as the Maisa Gavra is concerned, Zekei L'Yaveh was a very nice embellishment, but it's not ma'akiv. Now I have another note here that I wrote about Nifredu Olav. The Rabbanan say the following: that there's a fundamental difference between the following two categories: Nifredu Olav and Nifritzu Olav. Nifredu Olav means that the various, what word should I use? The leaves, if I could use that word, the leaves of the lulav was separated. They're no longer attached at the bottom. That's called Nifredu Olav. There is something called Nifritzu Olav, where he breaks some of the leaves of the lulav. Maybe he broke most of the leaves of the, whatever it might be. That's possible. So Nifritzu Olav is possible, but Nifredu Olav is kosher. B'di'evet. He shouldn't have used it. He should have gotten a better lulav. What's the difference between the two? Perhaps, according to Rav Soloveitchik, we can shed a light on this. Lulav tzarech agad. You have to bind the lulav and the other two minim, the adasim, the aravos, together. But the lulav itself has to be bound. Okay, nifredu olav. The leaves of the lulav have been separated; they're no longer attached. But I can bind them together. I can add we call it kaishalach, or whatever you want to call it, and bind it together. So when the Torah says kapos tmarim, that's the Torah's definite description of lulav. The Gemara says kafus. Oh, kafus means it has to be bound together. So you need a complete lulav. And if the lulav is separated, you can complete the lulav by binding it together. That's called nifredu olav. Because nifredu olav, even though the olav are separated, but you could bind them. Now, what happens if you pick up a lulav, pick up hadasim, pick up aravos in three separate actions? There was no agad. The answer is you're yotze. V'zecher zeh yotze, because agad is only lechatchila. But in the kiyum mitzvah, even without agad, lekachtem lachem, you took the 4 minutes and you yotze. But nifritzu olav is possible. If the leaves of the lulav were broken, then it's possible. Because then you're not binding together, and you cannot bind together the minim that are shlemim. If it's nifredu, the artificial binding, so to speak, makes it into one lulav, and it's a complete lulav. So even if you didn't bind it together, but it's royal, it lends itself to aga, to being bound together. But in the case of nifritzu, where he breaks off part of, chops off the head of the of some of the leaves of the lulav tree, he can no longer produce an agad, because an agad requires 3 minim b'shlemus that he binds together. And once again, we're applying the mechanism of Rav Soloveitchik, and we're saying that as far as the kiyum b'fol is concerned, the ma'aseh mitzvah, he can fulfill that without agad. But as far as the chefta is concerned, it has to lend itself to agad, to the exclusion of a case of nifritzu. Oh, not bad, huh? I mean, I'm impressed. To add so many things to my Rebbe, I don't usually. I hope he was smart. He would be smiling. You know? And I think the most basic example or precedent or a source, I would say, for the Rav's understanding here is Yibum. Because in Yibum, there are 2 parts to Yibum. There's the Maisa Yibum, and then you need Kriya. She reads the Parsha of Yibum. And the Gemara says that if the Chalitza was done without the Kriya, then it's meaningful, it's valid, and she's no longer Yivam L'Shuk, she can marry anyone else, even though she omitted the Kriya. But the Gemara says she has to be a Bar Hachi of Kriya. If she's mute and she cannot speak, then there's no Yivam. There cannot be Yivam. But wait a minute, you just finished telling me that if there was a chalitza without, I'm sorry, when I said yibum, I meant chalitza, of course. But you just finished saying that you can have chalitza without kriya. So why is it if she's mute, there's no chalitza? But the answer is you need roy l'kriya. As far as the ma'aseh b'fal, the actual action as it's implemented, there you can establish chalitza to be mater or l'shuk even without kriya. Okay. Now, I'm going to try to present a sheet of Rashi which appears on Daf Lamed Gimel Amud Beis, and we're going to see if we can tie that into our whole discussion. So let's fast forward for a moment to Lamed Gimel Amud Beis, and we'll see if we can examine this Rashi. Now, just a little bit of background here. The discussion is about the Musaf service of Rosh Hashana, which is made up, as you know, of 3 additional brachos, Malchus, Zichronos, and Shofar. But where's the Rashi? Just one second. Again, the Mishnah says Seder Tkio, Shalosh al Shalosh Shalosh, Shir Tkio, etc., Shir Chu, etc. Oh, so Rashi says Shalosh shel Shalosh Shalosh, Tkio Uchua Utkia, L'chol Achas V'Achas. Now, in order to appreciate this Rashi, that the blowing of the shofar is connected to Malchus, Zechronos, and Shofros, we have to really go back to Rashi al Torah and Parshas Emor. B'chodesh Hashvi, the Torah says, "V'echad lachodesh yilachem Shabbosom Zichron Trua Mikra Kodesh." Rashi says, "What is Zichron Trua? Psuke Zichronos, Psuke Shofros, Lizkar Lachem Akedes Yitzchak Shekarev Tachas Ha'ayam." So I'm not sure why Rashi omits Malchios here, but he definitely emphasized the Chronos and Shofros. And the implication is that that's how we fulfill the mitzvah d'oraisa of Zichron Trua. And the Ramban says no. The Ramban writes, Kol zeh asmachta midivreim, it's all d'Rabbanan. Now, if we combine the two Rashis, the Rashi al Torah of Zichron Trua, together with the Rashi here in the Mishnah Lam and Gimel and Beis, the Rashi says that the Tkios have to be blown al Seder HaBrachos on Malchus of Shofros, then we have one complete picture. And Rashi's saying that the only way of fulfilling shofar is by integrating the shofar into the structure of the Malchus of Shofros, which again, the Ramban cannot tolerate such a, Malchus of Shofros is the Rabbana. This is a very difficult Rashi here. That on the one hand, Rashi says to be Mekayim the mitzvah shofar, the Torah says Zichron Trua, you must have the recitation of Malchus of Shofros, which is only the Rabbanan. It can't make any sense. So Rav Soloveitchik is going to discuss this at great length. He doesn't believe for a moment that according to Rashi, Malchus of Shofars per se, as the backbone of Musaf, of the Shmon Esrei, is the Raisa. That can't be. But Rashi holds that although in and of itself, if you daven Musaf without Malchus Brachos, you violated the Drabbana. But as far as the integration of shofar and Malchus the Shofars, that's the Raisa according to Rashi. So in and of itself, as 3 sections, 3 brachos, that's the Rabban, and even Rashi would agree. But the integration of shofar into the framework of those 3 blessings, that's the Oraisa according to Rashi. So Mirza Hashem, we'll try to expand on this. All right then? Okay, have a great day.